our live stream for today. I hope that your weather is a little friendlier than ours. Despite being out of March, we are experiencing what we call herring weather here, which means the day starts out beautiful and sunny. And as I look out the window, it is snowing currently. We'll get snow, we'll get hail. It's pretty eclectic, but it is actually a welcome because it's a sign of spring is coming and the herring are returning and everything's coming back to life. So it's also a great excuse to stay inside and talk about bones, which is what our topic is going to be here today. So for today's live stream, I'm going to talk a little bit about the bird skeleton, basically, some of the neat adaptations that bird bones have, and also cover a little bit about what sort of damages we see to bones in our clinic and how we can treat them. So to start off, I should also stress that when I'm talking about a bird skeleton, in general, I'm referring to flighted birds. Birds that cannot fly, radites, or birds like ostriches or emus, they are going to have slightly different adaptations to their bones because they don't need that flying structure in comparison to, say, bald eagles. Joining me today is Walter, our fully articulated bald eagle skeleton, to help show out all of the amazing adaptations that these birds can have. Now, when it comes to the adaptations of a bird skeleton, like most other parts of the bird, it is all there to solve the problem of how do I fly? Flying is actually about the most strenuous activity that an animal can do. So when it comes to their skeleton, they need to have a perfect mix between flexibility and strength. In general, with flighted bird skeletons and their adaptations, you can think of the 3 R's. So the 3 R's are rigidity, reduction of mass, and redistribution of mass. Basically, the skeleton is going to help have a stable form to combat those intense forces they're generating when they're flying. To start off with, we are going to start at the very tip top, the skull. I've got some other lovely skulls here as well that we can see. This is a very nice golden eagle skull. Now, I mentioned rigidity. It's a hard word to say. And that is very apparent in the bird's skull. A lot of their bones are going to be fused. That's going to give them more structure without having to take up more space. Other notable features about birds when it comes to their skulls is their eye orbits are incredibly large compared to the rest of their skull. And inside those eye orbits, you can find a little structure called a scleral ring. Now, these sclerotic rings help keep the eye in place. And depending on the species, they can allow for a little bit of movement of the eyeball. Or if you're like a great horned owl, they lock those eyeballs in place. Eye tubes, rather. So an owl actually can't move its eyes at all in its skull. It has to rotate its entire head. Another pretty significant feature when it comes to bird skulls is, of course, their beak. Now, not everyone knows about this, but the beak of a bird has a couple different layers to it. At the very base of it is bone. So there's bone in this beak, and then it's going to be covered by this keratin sheath, keratin being very similar to what is our fingernails. So this keratin sheath is what we trim when we're trimming their beaks. If we hit the bone, that's also where there's blood flow. So then we can risk damaging the bird's beak. Pretty similar to if you trim your cat or your dog's toenails, you got to make sure you don't cut too deep because that's going to hurt the structure underneath. Now, this beak, outside of just being a fabulous adaptation, and depending on the bird, you're going to get a lot of different uses out of it. Our golden eagle, of course, as a raptor, is going to use their beak to rip and tear their food up, while a different bird, like a sandhill crane here, is going to use their beak to stab for little invertebrates or amphibians over in the water, as well as eat corn out of the field. But all of these birds have the benefits and the weight reduction of not having teeth. Teeth are pretty darn heavy, and for us mammals at least, and us humans, to go along with those heavy teeth, we also have very heavy, dense jaw muscles to help us chew. Doing away with that, birds instead just have their beak, the upper and the lower maxilla. And instead of any chewing being done in their mouth, what they'll actually do is just rip the pieces up until they can swallow them. And then most distribution of mass, that's going to help them stay a lot more balanced. They've got some chemicals that help break down their food, and then they've got a structure that will physically mash that food up. So all the digestion is going to take place down there. One other interesting feature that you can find in bird skulls is where their tongue is located. Their tongue is actually comprised of a couple of different bones. Altogether, it's known as the hyoid apparatus. If you've heard of it before in relation to birds, I'm going to guess you've heard of it because of woodpeckers. Woodpeckers have an incredibly long hyoid apparatus. That's what's going to help them stick their tongue into holes looking for bugs. Their hyoid apparatus is so large, it actually will wrap around the back of their head. Pretty significant. Moving on from just the skull structure itself, we next, of course, come to the vertebrae, the spine all the way down. Now, compared to humans or other mammals, the spine of birds is going to be a lot stiffer, and some of the column is actually going to be fused together. That's going to give the midline of the bird's body a lot of structure and form. And it's also going to allow a stable platform for a couple other parts of the body, namely the pectoral and the pelvic girdle. You want those two parts of the body to have a lot of structure and to be stable, because those two parts of the body are what are going to be experiencing the most force, the twisting, the bending when birds are flying, the landing when they're coming down on the ground. So they need that really strong backbone to help support them. If we're looking at just the neck, the cervical vertebrae, birds can have a variety of numbers when it comes to their cervical vertebrae. It all depends on how they're living, what they're trying to hunt, how they're trying to get along in their life. We humans, we have 7. It's a very respectable number. But birds can have anywhere from 12 to 25 cervical vertebrae. So while their vertebrae are a bit more fused together, they still tend to have a lot more neck flexibility than we do because they've just got simply more items in the chain. That's also how you can get birds like great horned owls, and all owls really, to be able to still have a good range of vision, because while their eyes are locked in place, they've got 14 cervical vertebrae. So they can turn their head almost about 280 degrees in a circle, which is very, very nice. I can do maybe 90 on a good day. I should stretch more. A quick stop at the ribs. Birds typically have 7 ribs on either side, and they're also going to have these little backwards pointing processes called the unicate process. Those are going, again, to provide rigidity to the skeleton. They're going to attach the ribs to each other, as well as the sternum and the spine. But where bird skeletons really kind of come out on their own to be big and impressive is what's called the pectoral girdle. That's this section right in here. The pectoral girdle is made of a couple of different bones. Namely, it is made of the clavicles, which are these bones right here, the coracoids, which are these bones back behind the clavicles, the scapula, which, just like us, it's their shoulder blade, although theirs is much tinier, and then this big plate right here, which is the sternum. Now, the sternum is one way that flighted birds are going to differ a lot from non-flighted birds. So if you look at the sternum of, say, an ostrich, they are not going to have this nice structure on here. This big, tall structure is known as the keel, or sometimes it's called the carinate, and it's where a lot of the flight muscles are going to attach. Ostriches and emus, they don't need those flight muscles. What's interesting, though, is that even in birds like penguins, who can't fly in the air, they still need big, strong muscles to help fly through the ocean. So they will still have this beautiful keel structure on their chest. Now, the sternum, this flat structure right here, is going to be very crucial because it's basically the housing for the muscles that are going to pull the wings up and down, up and down. The next part, the coracoid, these bones back here, are going to brace the thorax, sort of the chest area, against the force of the flight muscles. Without these coracoids, if they are damaged, if they're not strong and straight and healthy, the thorax actually would collapse from the force of that flight pressure when they're moving through the air. So coracoids are an incredibly crucial bone when it comes to flighted birds. I'll talk a little bit later about how they can also be a very difficult bone to heal. Up in front here, we've got the clavicles. These are also known as the furcula, or if you are a big bird eater, you might know them as the wishbone. So in birds, these clavicles are fused together, and they basically allow for flexibility during flight. A good way to think of the clavicles is essentially a flexible spring suspension system. They're going to help take the impact and make sure that it doesn't affect too much of the rest of the bird. The scapula does make up a lot of the pectoral girdle, it does make up part of the pectoral girdle, but really where it shines is when it is in conjunction with those coracoid bones. So between the scapula and the coracoid bones, they're going to act together basically as a pulley system when the bird is flying. So it's going to help decrease the energy need of that flight and make it a little easier on the bird as it's doing this big extended work. Moving on from the pectoral girdle, we are going to head on out to the wings. Now, the wings might look fairly similar to ours, and that's fairly accurate. They do have a humerus. In birds, the humerus is going to be relatively short and stout compared to the entire length of the wing, and that again has to do with those incredible forces that are acting on the bird. It's going to need to have that short, stout nature so it can be a little bit stronger because it's bearing such heavy forces. Out here on the radius and ulna, the ulna more specifically, if you get a close look up at a bird's wing, you might notice there are little bumps on that bone. Those bumps are actually where feathers attach. So it does depend on the species, but in our predatory species, like a bald eagle, there's secondary flight feathers, which would be located right around here. They attach directly into the bone. Sometimes we do get people who think that if a bird is stuck to the ice, that pulling out the feather is a good solution. That is definitely not a good solution because they are attached straight to the bone. It's much better to cut the feathers. They're going to be damaged, but they can regrow. Whereas if you pull a feather right out from that part of the wing, you could risk major damage to that wing structure. Moving out to here, birds do have a couple of digits, much like we do, but their digits are all fused together, and that's going to help, again, offer that support and structure. These wing tips need to be incredibly sensitive when it comes to flying. To steer and to maneuver through the air, they're going to just do slight alterations of how their feathers are facing. So having this big, strong structure out here is going to make sure that their wing stays straight and they're able to actually use it to maneuver during the air. It's not flopping all over the place, much like when I make paper airplanes. That's why they don't fly, because they go everywhere. Going down a little bit onto the skeleton, we come to the pectoral girdle, which is, again, multiple bones that are all fused together. And this fusion is really crucial to the bird because it provides a strong center platform for the leg muscles as well as the tail muscles. Birds have a very reduced tail compared to a lot of other animals, but they do still need those muscles to have a good support system because the tail, much like the wingtips, is incredibly crucial in flight, especially when it comes to braking. If they don't have control over that tail, they are going to be in a rough spot. That's about all I've got to say about the pelvic girdle. There's not a lot. It's strong. It's got that rigidity. The fusion also helps reduce the number of parts. Next on our little stop, though, we've got the legs and the feet. The talons, much like the beak, as I said before, are going to be comprised of bone with a little keratin sheath over the top of them. That keratin sheath keeps growing. Out in the wild, birds will typically keep that keratin sheath at a nice even level by eating food with big bones in it. They're landing on rocks. They're landing on thick tree branches. The talons are just sort of wearing away naturally, or rather keeping in shape naturally, not wearing away. Here at the Raptor Center, though, I'm sure if you've seen some of our videos, we have to do that maintenance on our birds. A big reason for that is that simply here with us, they're getting a lot more nutrients than they would in the wild. So their beak and talons are growing a lot faster than they would in the wild. They're also getting a little easier food. We will sometimes give them bones as enrichment for them to play with, to pick the meat off of. But a lot of our food for our education birds is used to train with them. So we've got to cut those pieces up so we can actually work with them instead of just giving them a whole chunk and going about our day. For the leg bones, though, the femur is pretty much the only bone that is going to look similar to a mammal. Once we get away from that femur, we do technically have a tibia and fibia, but the fibia is incredibly reduced. And this structure is more commonly referred to as the tibiotarsus instead of the tibia and the fibia. Down here, we've got the tarsometatarsus, which is going to be a bunch of lower foot bones that have all been fused and stretched out as well. That's going to give the bird a lot more leverage for when it's walking or when it's trying to jump and take off into the air. Now, because birds are covered in feathers, oftentimes people will only see this bone on the back of the bird. And they will think that this bone is the knee pointing backwards. It is in fact not the knee. This is our bird's knee way up here. Typically it's hidden in the feathers though, so you can't really see it. This little bone pointing backwards can be sort of thought of as a heel. So this little bone, it can be more thought of as a heel than anything else. And from the heel past the tarsometatarsus, we get down into the rest of these foot bones. Toe bones, I should stress, because with birds, when they are walking on the ground, they are not walking on their foot bones, they are walking on their toes, unlike us. When it comes to the toes of the bird, they're going to have a number of different phalanges depending on which digit it is. Typically, birds will have 4 digits total, and this back digit is referred to as the halix. It is incredibly crucial for a bird's ability to walk as well as to hunt and get around in the world. In our birds of prey, this halix is what they use to deliver a lot of the killing force when they're going after their meal. So we do have a bird here at the center. She's got a couple of injuries, but the main one is that she's missing a halix on her back foot. Without that halix, she can't really hunt. The halix has been compared to sort of the big thumb as in terms of crucial need for that bird to have. Now that is a sort of quick overview of the skeletal system of a bird. We're going to move on now to one of my favorite parts, which is talking about another adaptation that these bones have that we can't really see unless we crack them open. Because birds, if they're flighted, tend to have what's called pneumatic bones. Namely, the humerus and the femur is where you'll find these systems in the most amount. A pneumatic bone is a bone that essentially has little pockets of air inside of it. So you'll often hear people say bird bones are hollow. They're not hollow like a straw. Instead, it's more of a honeycomb pattern where there's little spaces for air, but then there's also all these bony struts that help provide support and rigidity. Now, the other thing you'll often hear when people are saying birds have hollow bones is that they have these hollow bones to help them fly, which is kind of true, but not necessarily in the way you might think. Because when it comes to bird bones, they are incredibly dense structures. In fact, if you compared a bird bone to a mammal of a similar weight, the bird bone is going to be denser than the mammal bone, and it's going to weigh about the same as that mammal bone. So if we had a 10-pound mammal, its humerus would weigh just about as much as this bald eagle's humerus. However, these pneumatic bones are still very crucial for flight. And that all comes back to what I said earlier about flight being one of the most strenuous activities an animal can do. Because it's a strenuous activity, it requires a lot of energy. And where they're going to get that energy is from oxygen, from their breathing. If a bird were to only rely on its lungs to get oxygen to power its flight, it would not be able to fly very well. So instead, these pneumatic bones are basically part of the bird's respiratory system. It's how the bird is able to breathe enough to be able to power its flight. Pneumatic bones are not found on all birds. Some of our unflighted birds definitely don't have pneumatic bones. And even some birds that tend to dive down into the ocean for their food. So in the case of loons, they don't have the pneumatic bone system that you'll see in a bald eagle because they're not as concerned with flying in the air as they are with swimming under the water. They can, of course, still fly, but it's a lot harder for them to take off. They need to actually be on water to get off into the air. Now, because of these pneumatic bones, when we get birds into our clinic that have fractures, it can be a lot harder than if just it's a mammal with a broken bone. Birds also have a couple of other difficulties when it comes to healing a broken bone. One of the biggest things that we need to figure out when a bird comes in with a broken bone is where is that bone located? Because if a bone is broken, it needs blood to heal. And if that bone is in part of the body that doesn't have a lot of soft tissue, namely out on the wings, kind of all along this part of the wings, definitely all down around the toes, there's not a lot of soft tissue there. So if there's a break there, it's potential that the bone won't actually heal, but rather die. That's one thing we have to look at. We also have to look at where on the body the break is, because, of course, if we want this bone to heal good and straight, then we're going to want to try to stabilize that bone. This is where the coracoids will often come in. As you can imagine, we can't put a cast on a coracoid break. I don't know if any center does, but that's not something that we have discovered how to do quite yet because they're back behind those clavicles. The best we can do with a coracoid break is keep the bird in a quiet, safe location, relatively small so they can't move around a lot, and hope that that bone is going to heal as good and straight as it needs to. Coracoid breaks are a huge problem for birds because if that coracoid doesn't heal evenly, then that whole pulley system is disrupted. The bird might not be able to attain lift as well, or it might not be able to turn in the air as much. If it's a break on a bone like the radius and the ulna, that can be a little bit easier because if only one of those bones is broken, the other one can act as a stabilizing agent. So basically, if the radius is broken, the ulna can be a little bit of a splint and help keep it all in shape, which will make it a lot more likely that that bone will heal straight. However, it still can be difficult because we also have to look at where the break is on the bone. If a break is too close to a joint, that is a big problem for birds. Even if it is a leg bone where they don't need quite as much control, it's not as crucial as flying. The problem that arises is that if a bird breaks its bone very close to the joint, then it's going to be more likely that arthritis will happen. And when it comes to birds, arthritis takes the form of the bone essentially dissolving. So if that break is too close to the joint, it's very unlikely it's going to heal well enough, and it's very, very unlikely that arthritis is not going to arise. In general, the greater the diameter of the bone, the farther from a joint the break has to be for that bird to be a candidate for rehabilitation. So if it's a break on the humerus, we want it farther away from the joint than if it's a break on the radius or the ulna. Now, when it comes to bird bones, they can heal amazingly quickly, which can be great, but it can also be a big problem. Because if a bird gets a broken bone over in Cake, Alaska, by the time that bird gets to us, it might have already healed in a disadvantageous position, basically. It might have healed wrong. And because of the delicate nature of these bird bones and these pneumatic bones in their humerus and their femur, if a bone heals wrong, we can't necessarily re-break it and hope it's going to heal better the second time. So if we ever get a bird into our clinic with a broken bone, they go to the top of the patient list. We want to try and get that bone stabilized and straight as quickly as we can. When we get birds into our clinic with broken bones, we also have to look at whether or not if it's an open or a closed fracture. An open fracture is where the bone has come out through the skin. If it's something that's lower down on the wing, again, that's already a very dangerous spot. There's not a lot of soft tissue, so there's not a lot of blood flow. And if it's an open fracture, that can dry out very quickly. So if it's a bird that's coming from outside of Sitka with an open fracture, what we'll actually recommend professionals do is put some sort of lubricating jelly on it, sterilized, obviously, and then slap some saran wrap on that. That way the wound is going to stay moist, and we've got a better chance, it's still going to be hard, but we've got a better chance of making sure that bone is going to heal correctly. Now, believe it or not, when it comes to the flight bones, because they're so strongly fused, if a bird gets a break in that flight bone and we're able to stabilize the wing in time, even if it doesn't heal perfectly straight, it can still heal well enough to manipulate its flight. And I'm trying to think of other breaks. But most of the breaks that we see here are going to be those coracoid breaks. We will oftentimes get toe breaks. That can happen when birds get caught in leg hold traps trying to escape. And then the radius and the ulna tend to be the more bones that we see broken as well. But wherever the break occurs, again, it is very, very time critical. So if you ever encounter a bird that you think might have a broken bone, please make sure to call the professional authorities who can come help that bird as soon as possible. And that is my little fast talk about all of the bone, most of the bones, some of the bones in a bird's body and all of the amazing adaptations they have that are solving that #1 concern for birds, which is how can I get up in the air? Now, if there are any questions, I would be happy to take those.
We had a couple that came in. One of the first ones was someone said, I may have come in late, but did you talk at all about the ability to pin bird bones that have been broken?
Oh, I did not talk about the ability to pin bird bones that have been broken, not in specifics. However, so when it comes to pinning bird bones, it is possible, but again, it's going to be very dependent on where that break is. For example, in personal experience, a couple years ago, we had a bald eagle come in with a broken femur. Now, we did put a pin in it, and then we attached an external stabilizer, basically just a big soft foam to keep that bone straight. The problem, though, is that we can't really stabilize the knee and the hip joint. We can't lock those in place. So the bird was using it, and it made it very, very difficult for that break to heal. So pinning can be a solution, but it's best if you have to pin a bone that you can also lock into position those joints on either side of the bone. So if, for example, the humerus was broken, we would put a pin in that, put an external fixator to keep the pin in place, and then we would also likely bandage the wing to the bird's side. That way it's not moving its shoulder and its elbow and potentially disrupting the pin. I know in the past there have been some birds where we put a pin directly into the bone and left it in there, but that's not a practice that we do as much anymore just because we weren't seeing necessarily great results in terms of the trauma of that bird going through surgery.
And this one is a little bit more complicated, but it's, I know that birds use oxygen more efficiently than humans do. Is part of that the air sacs in the hollow bones?
Part of it is the air sacs in the hollow bones. So they've got more of like a two-step respiratory system. And it's so efficient that they almost never have any carbon dioxide in their lungs, unlike us. When we exhale, we're not getting rid of everything. With birds, when they exhale and inhale, they are flushing the whole system every time. So it's much more efficient thanks to those bone lungs. Yeah, basically everything you learn about birds in flight just crushes those dreams of when you were a child and we're like, what if I have wings? I could fly. It's like, well, no, you also need pneumatic bones. You also need a keel. You also need to get rid of your teeth and your jaw muscles. So.
When we're coping our birds with a Dremel, trimming those beaks and talons, do you think it hurts the bird?
When we're coping the bird with a Dremel and trimming its beaks and talons, do I think it hurts the bird? I do not think it hurts the bird as long as we are careful and don't get to the bone part of the structure where the blood vessels are. Because when we're trimming the beaks and talons, all we're doing is shortening the keratin sheath. There's no nerve endings in that. It might tickle a little bit. And we can actually do something similar to ourselves, is sometimes you might Dremel your fingernails if you feel like it. It's about same to that experience. It's a little vibration. It feels a little weird, but there's no pain involved. And for birds, it's even easier because they don't have all this soft tissue around their nails. We can just get right to that keratin. Any other questions I can answer?
So you're saying you can't use bird bones as a sippy straw?
You could. You would just have to clean out some of the insides a bit. Also, you could only do that with chickens or turkeys. I would very strongly not recommend doing it with any native bird species because that would be incredibly illegal. But yeah, next time you get a roast chicken, try it out.
Are all the bones on the bird hollow?
Are all the bones on the bird hollow? That is a great question, and the answer to that is no. Only some of the bones are pneumatic. It's going to depend on the species, of course, but in general, it's going to be the humerus and the femur that have the most air sacs. The bones farther away from the body are not. There's just not really space for air sacs, and it wouldn't really be helpful for the respiratory system.
Those are, and I quote, spooky, scary skeleton having it.
I like that. Yes, our spooky, scary skeleton is named Walter. That is the name that was given to him at the Juneau Raptor Center, and when they sent him down to us, we were more than happy to keep it up. Normally, Walter has some sort of seasonally appropriate attire, but he wanted to show off all of his bones today, so we got rid of the little hat.
I think that's about all the questions I'm seeing at the moment.
Okay, great. All right, well, that sounds like that's all the questions that we have. If you think of anything later, feel free to write in. I very much like talking and learning about bones. Just as a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you go to our website or go to our gift store, anything purchased at our gift store goes directly back to our center. We also have memberships as well as our Adopt a Raptor program if you want to help basically fund for the caretaking of all of the beautiful birds that we've got here at the center. Other than that, I hope everyone has a great Saturday. Is the day today.
Before we sign off, we have one more question.
Oh, yes.
How far can an eagle see?
How far can an eagle see? That's not bones at all. But I can answer it anyways. So in terms of maximum distance, I have yet to find a study that says how far they can see at their upper limit. However, what we do know is that if you have an eagle on one side of a football field and you've got someone holding up a newspaper on the other side, that eagle can make out font that is only an inch tall. To put it in more miles, they can see about half a mile down clearly, and they can actually even change how far they can see because they can contract and expand the lens in their eyes. So they can basically give themselves a pair of binoculars if they want. They've also got a great feature where their eyes are slightly polarized. So for us, if we look into the water, oftentimes we just see the glare off the water and can't see what's underneath. Eagle eyes can fix that problem. They'll see right down, which is how they can find all those delicious fish they're trying to eat. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining me and learning a bit about bones with me. I hope everyone has a great day, and we will see you later.